Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Tammy Coates, and I'm a member of the client services team here at G2. I've probably met or spoken to a lot of you over the years, but today we're here to talk about something that's somewhat overlooked at times, kind of an area of risk, and that's when you do not have a URL on file for a merchant and how G2 can kind of help and fill that gap a bit. So this is going to be a short little webinar, probably about 20 minutes. So I'll briefly turn it over to Austin Denson from marketing to cover some housekeeping items.
Thanks, Tammy. Appreciate it. And thanks, Kevin. We are so excited to have you on the call today. It's been a pleasure getting to know you and work with you throughout this process. And thank you most to the viewers who are on the call for taking time out of your schedule to be with us. I'm going to cover two slides really quick. First will be a disclaimer. The next one will be housekeeping, so I'll make sure it's really fast here. There are three key points to the message on the screen here. One, we do not work with Visa, MasterCard, or any other payment networks. Two, we do not speak for their brands or companies. And I promise a third one here. Today's presentation does not constitute legal or other professional advice. Next slide, please, Tammy. Thank you. All right, a few things left for me to cover, and then we'll get to the good stuff. Go ahead and submit your questions to the GoToWebinar questions panel. We encourage you to do this throughout the session, and we'll get to those questions near the end of the session, and we'll try to answer as many as we can given time. There also is an alternative method, so for those that prefer a more private approach, feel free to email us with any questions or comments about today's presentation, or really anything merchant compliance related to marketing@g2llc.com. I'll say that again, marketing@g2llc.com. And then next, I'd like to turn your attention to the handouts tab, where we have 3 downloads. One will be a PDF version of the presentation deck. We have a web ID case study infographic that was just released that we're excited about. And then we have a G2 web ID data sheet. And then lastly, I'd like to mention that a recording of the webinar will be sent to all of you by early next week via email. So with that, Tammy, I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Austin. So we'll just kind of jump in again. Again, my name's Tammy, and I'm excited to chat with you guys today about web ID. Like I said, I work on the client services team, but I do actually oversee this operations team as well, so it's a little bit close to my heart. So for those of you that may not know, web ID is our solution that identifies merchant URLs that were previously undisclosed to an organization. So it's usually an add-on, kind of feeds into your monitoring solutions, and it just kind of allows our clients to get a more complete picture of a merchant's risk. But today I have the pleasure of being joined by Kevin Lambert. I personally worked with Kevin for a few years, so I'm happy to have him on here with me today. He's a risk expert who has firsthand experience with all types of merchants and the web ID tool. He's currently the Senior Vice President at KeyBank, overseeing merchant acquiring risk, and he has more than 20 years experience in finance, operations, and risk management. He's an expert at building infrastructure and processes to add payment revenue, and of course, critical to that is kind of having a comprehensive understanding of all risk and compliance best practices. So Kevin, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. Happy to be here.
All right, cool. So I guess we'll just kind of jump in then. To start, I was just, thinking about why a merchant might not have a URL on file. So could you kind of walk us through like an application process and, again, specifically why or would or wouldn't have a URL provided?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of why a URL may not be provided, I mean, there could be a few reasons. One, it might be a situation where the merchant just doesn't have one. And in that instance, they may not have it, but later on in their business cycle, they add one. But when we receive the application, it may not be there. Another reason is they just choose not to tell you, which is potentially not a good sign, but it does happen. But beyond that, I mean, typically, we these days we are seeing it more often than not seeing it, but it does occur enough where a tool like the one we're talking about today is important.
Yeah, and then, so these are generally like brick and mortar type merchants? Because I would
Yeah,
imagine
for the most part, for the ones that you won't get one for, there are brick and mortar. Something to us comes as that there's any type of e-commerce activity. So in terms of a normal merchant application, that's usually a field. How much of the volume expected is going to be e-commerce. So that's obviously a telltale sign to expect one. So for those types of applications, you're always going to get one. But really for the brick and mortars that may not even think about it. Maybe they do even have a website that but it's not for e-commerce. It's really just more informative and for information, which is another reason why you might not get it. They just might not think that because it's e-commerce or because it's not e-commerce, they may think that, hey, it's just not that relevant.
right. Yeah. So for the ones, just going back to what you said, if they come on as e-commerce merchants, they have to provide a URL then, which makes sense. Do you are your underwriting team kind of validating those URLs as they come through, or is it kind of like they check the e-commerce box, they kind of plug something in, but it could be junk or a dummy URL or anything like that?
Yeah, oh, for sure. Anytime we see a URL, that requires, a website review. Going to the website, validating, that it lines up with the products being sold, making sure that there's privacy policy, refund policy, and and there is some review of the website relative to just looking for things that we've been trained to look for, really relative to transaction laundering. Is there correct grammar? Do prices line up with what the products are, et cetera? Just making sure that the work that we do, we're kind of ruling out any concerning items that could lead to transaction laundering or something else that might lead to a financial loss.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I have seen, in my experience, that we'll receive records without a URL at all, and also records, like I was saying, that's like an email address is in there, or like kind of the, example.com or, abc.com, like kind of the dummy websites people will just plug in. So, we kind of shuffle both of those through the web ID process, if it's just kind of like not a real URL or if there's no URL provided. So I was just curious if you kind of had both on your end, but it sounds like you would mainly just see the ones without anything populated.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in terms of the manual review, I would expect the underwriter to pick up on, a dummy website if it's obvious, like you said, example.com or 123abc, .com,
Yeah.
those types of things, I would expect, underwriter to pick up on during their review of the application. But when it comes to just data being loaded onto a system, if for some reason that data does get through to a database, it does become a little bit more complicated because now that field is actually full. So when you're thinking about the web ID product and you want to send over the URLs, you actually not only have to look for what's blank, but you also have to run a little bit of logic to say, okay, if it's some type of obvious, like I said, if it's abc.com, something along those lines, that's might be something that we would want to validate as well.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So after, just quickly, we get the data from you or, from whatever organization we're working with, we kind of segregate it, right? We'll say these are the ones that need to go to web ID. These are the ones that they already have a URL and file, and we can just add that into the monitoring solutions. Clients can segregate themselves too, like they can send it over separately, or we can do that on their behalf. So once we get that, we send it through web ID, we find the URL. Generally speaking, we find about 50%, give or take. Is that kind of your experience or what you recall?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what I've seen is it's definitely in that 40 to 50% range of the initial screening. So, in my experience, there's that upfront screening where you've gone through and you've identified in your entire portfolio all the merchants that don't have a URL or potentially a fake URL. You send that over, and then you hit that 40 to 50% range. But from there, we and again, in my experience, we would go. There's a monthly process. So now you've got the portfolio uploaded, and then as that portfolio grows, you want to make sure you capture that as well. So there's a monthly process of sending up that those merchants that don't have a URL to make sure that there's nothing there that you need to know about.
Right, yeah, makes sense. So once we kind of complete that process, we will automatically add it into ongoing monitoring, like I mentioned. So kind of the content and TL monitoring aspects, which is probably one of the higher values or reasons you might use it, just having, you know, a little more controls over those merchants. But we also do provide you the data itself, like a sheet of kind of like, hey, here's what we found, here's what we didn't find. So really quickly, we did a kind of a study recently with a large acquirer, and you know, they sent us around 137,000 records over a 6-month span. About a third of those didn't have URLs. So, you know, about 35,000 went through that web ID process. We found about 48%, I almost said 48,000 there, but 48%. And that, you know, is kind of in that range that we spoke about. So of those 16,000 records that we found, we flagged like 43 different merchants for alerts, whether that be content or TL, right? And I found this kind of interesting. I'm sure this isn't really something you would track or anyone outside of G2 might track, but I found it interesting that the termination rate, so within our portal going in and saying we're not processing for this merchant anymore based on these findings, right, was double what it was for the URLs that they did provide. So it's kind of interesting, and I know there's a ton of reasons why that may be, and probably from your purview, it's all one bucket and it is what it is. But, you know, I would kind of think that essentially no one really had eyes on these URLs prior to Web ID, and that might play into that a bit. Does that make any sense to you? Or
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense. And listen, I really like the analysis that you've done here and the results. From my perspective, you know, the priority was always, hey, if there's not a URL and one truly exists, we want to know about it as quickly as possible and get it into the monitoring process. And then ultimately, if that particular URL led to some type of risk issue where we need to take action in terms of maybe even closing the merchant, that was always the focus. So, you know, from my perspective, it wasn't so much about the analysis that you've done here. Was really how, you know, getting the information monitored as quickly as possible, and then if there is a problem, reacting to that appropriately. So I think this is a great data point. I think it's interesting. And I'm glad you're sharing it. But again, you know, from my perspective, it was always just about, you know, whether they came to us with a URL or not. It was really how quickly are we identifying and taking action against the ones that are actually doing something they shouldn't be doing.
right, it's kind of an assessment, and all that is an assessment. I didn't really care where it came from at that point. I'd imagine.
But I will say, you know, just looking at this, I mean, I think again, I really like the stat, and it just to me just lends to the, you know, the quality of the product and being able to make sure that you've identified all the URLs.
Yeah, I just thought it was kind of interesting, and I was like, well, it does sort of make sense, because this essentially could be sort of a whole new, you know, site that's being looked at. So
Absolutely.
yeah. So then once we, you know, we pass off the records to you, it's in monitoring, we're looking for the content and the TL aspects. We give you the sheet back, kind of saying, you know, broad numbers. You gave us 100 to look for, we found 50. So what do you do with that data from that point?
So, I mean, that becomes part of, now we have the URL. So that goes into the database of the information for that specific merchant. So obviously, if G2 alerts us to something to whether it's web content monitoring or transaction laundering issues, we'll take a look at that. But it also becomes a point of data for our ongoing investigation. So if we never heard from G2 on a particular URL, but it came up for another reason in our risk monitoring process, such as, you know, kind of some basic rules, if you know, there's excessive authorizations or volume threshold breaches, that's another data point that we're looking at as a part of the risk investigation. We'll go to the website, we'll review it, we'll, you know, relative to what the specific investigation is about, we'll see what information we can gather to see if it makes us, you know, more comfortable or less comfortable. And so that that data is not only important from a web content transaction monitoring process, it's also important from an overall risk management process, because now we have access to it. And then beyond that, for certain merchants, we'll do periodic reviews, which is just an annual reassessment of the merchant. And if for some reason the URL didn't exist at the time of the original underwriting, through the periodic review process, we'll have that information, and that'll be part of the periodic review to again, just to make sure that we're dealing with what we expect to be dealing with, and there's no issues that we could uncover on their website that would give us some pause.
Okay, is that, just out of curiosity, is that periodic review like random or based on like an MCC or something like that?
It's actually, different companies do it differently, but really it's a risk-based approach, which is to say that the ones that may have more exposure to us as a merchant acquirer, or maybe a higher risk category, in the e-commerce space, for example, depending on what your portfolio looks like. But in those instances, we want to be looking at those merchants at least once a year. And so there's a process, you pull it based on the risk profile, and then you just go through and you basically re-underwrite the merchant, and that becomes part of your internal reporting. And if something is uncovered, during that process, then it gets investigated with the merchant to determine if any action is required.
Okay, gotcha. So kind of as a add-on to WebID, you can like get e-com detection, what we call it, which is relatively self-explanatory, but essentially we can kind of flag the URL for having e-commerce, which again, in theory, a lot of these aren't supposed to, or at least you're not processing for the e-commerce side. So is that something you could ingest into your system as well? Like kind of flag that in your system as being e-commerce, even if they're not boarded with you as such?
Yeah, I mean, if we boarded something that said it was 100%, swipe business, for example, but we find out later, yeah, we can absolutely go in to the risk system and even the underwriting system and modify that field, really particularly from a risk standpoint, just to make sure that if anything were to occur with that merchant, the risk analyst is aware that there's e-commerce transactions. So yeah, that's helpful for us.
Yeah. Okay, and then I know earlier you mentioned you kind of have typically done this in a monthly cadence.
Yeah, and I think different companies do it differently, which I don't know that there's a right way, but from my perspective, because that URL can potentially lead to problems that would result in fines, and we know the fines can be material. It was always very important to get information, to get those the merchants that didn't have a URL uploaded as quickly as possible. So upfront, and then my recommendation is a monthly upload, to G2 of all of those all those merchants that don't have a URL, in addition to what you would typically upload. So again, just making sure that there's complete visibility, because time is of the essence, when it comes to some of the problems that can develop. So you want to make sure that you're getting that information uploaded on a monthly basis, and then it goes into the pool of everything that's being monitored.
Perfect, yeah. And then, like you said, people kind of do it on different cadences. So, we see quarterly or even annually sometimes. A lot of different variations we could do with that. Recently we've seen kind of more doing the e-com add-on, like kind of a larger project, a one-time large project for the WebID and e-com, and those kind of being turned into leads for the business development teams of these organizations, which is something I hadn't really thought of, to be honest with you, but kind of makes sense if there's e-com business to go out and grab. And then also it kind of allows them to split the cost center a bit. So kind of something else to consider when, thinking of what you can with this tool.
I mean, I think that's a great idea. I mean, now the data's in our systems, and if the business development team are looking for opportunities to expand in the world of e-commerce for something that they don't know that we have as potentially an e-commerce merchant, the data's there. All they have to do is just mine it, and then put together a program to pursue it. And the good news about that type of strategy is hopefully at that point that particular merchant's been with us for 30, 60, 90 days. So really your chances of it being something that we wouldn't want, i.e. web content issues or transaction laundering, those go way down. So now you're dealing with a good quality lead versus something that might be considered a little bit more cold.
Yeah, that makes sense too. Cool. I think that's kind of all like the general questions I had. So I think we're going to kind of switch like a Q&A mode here, see if there's any questions from the audience that we can help answer. So Austin, if you see anything rolling in.
Yes, we have a few questions rolling here. I'll start with the first one. When putting URLs into monitoring, do you do that in-house?
I think that's probably for you, Kevin, kind of what monitoring means.
Yeah, I mean, so well, I guess just probably there's two aspects to that question, so I'll try and tackle both. One is a known URL obviously is something that would go into our system, but in terms of getting that data over to G2, yes, we internally would create a file process where we've identified the query of merchants that are going over. So upfront, there's you do your entire portfolio, but then on an ongoing basis, you're gonna want to query for any new merchants that came onto the books, and then ensuring that any of those merchants that don't have a URL are part of that query as too, and then that file just gets sent over to G2 and for uploading.
Perfect.
Great, thanks, Kevin.
Yep.
And then the next question rolling in: can we get a demo of the upload process on G2?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very, very similar to the upload process you're already doing for like the PMM piece of it. It would kind of, like I said earlier, you can either segregate the data yourself, like have two separate files, or just kind of combine it all in one and we can split it out on your behalf. But yeah, happy to kind of walk through that process with anyone that would like to have a demo.
Thanks, Tammy. Next question: aside from missing URLs, what else do you look for?
I don't know. I'll start with that, Kevin. We probably both answer that in some regards. So, so for the web ID piece, like I said, we look for the URL. We can also identify if there's e-com, as I mentioned. And then on top of that, there's another layer that we can also identify the different service providers and shopping carts and all that kind of thing that touches that site in the web ID piece. And then outside of web ID, we have, the MCC program where we kind of identify a proper MCC, see if there's mismatches, things of that nature. But those are kind of the general things we're looking for.
Yeah, and I guess what I would add to that is, it's probably worth mentioning that there could be a segment of your portfolio that goes through some type of auto approval process. So in those instances, those are typically low risk merchants, and that's how they're generally set up. But if something does queue to either be reviewed or is considered a little bit high risk and wouldn't fall through to your auto approval process, there's a number of things that we're looking for just in terms of that individual merchant. A lot of it's the standard underwriting stuff that I'm sure most people on this call would be familiar with. But again, just specific to kind of the URL world, and we talked about this a little earlier, but just making sure that you're going to the website and you're validating that the products are sold are what the merchant is actually put on their application. You're going through the website, making sure it meets card brand rules. You're validating the privacy policy. You're looking for things like inaccurate grammar or pricing that doesn't quite kind of pass the smell test, if you will. And then from there, it's just completing the balance of the underwriting process.
Thank you both. Another question rolling in: is there an API to automate the upload process?
Yes, we do have APIs set up for uploads, as well as kind of delivering the content and TL results back to you as well. So you can reach out to client services or your direct relationship manager or CS manager if you want more details and the specs on that.
Perfect, Tammy. And I think we're coming up on time, so I have one more question here. What merchant data do you need for Web ID?
Oh, that's actually a really good question. So generally speaking, it's the same data we typically get for all merchants, like, you know, the merchant name, phone number, email address, principal name, that kind of stuff. So the more data you provide, honestly, the better collection rate you're going to see, because we just have more data points to, you know, kind of validate and match it up to the merchant itself. But I think at a minimum, we would need a merchant name and an address and an MCC code.
Great, thanks, Tammy. I think that's about all we have for questions or the time we have, so I'll turn it back over to you to close us out. And thanks
Okay.
again, Kevin.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me today, Kevin. Really appreciate having you, and good seeing your face in a little box again. It's been a while.
Likewise.
Yeah. So if anyone else has any additional questions, please feel free to email them over, reach out to us directly. You can kind of see all of our emails listed on the screen there. We will, as Austin mentioned earlier, this presentation's in the download tab. You'll be able to find both of this recording and the infographic relating to the case study I mentioned that Kevin and I talked about will be on our website in the coming days at g2llc.com. And we'll also include both in our follow-up email next week when the recording goes live. Or not live, it's recording, but when it's on the website. So anyway, but thank you so much for everyone. That kind of concludes our session for today. Appreciate you coming on again, Kevin, and thanks for everyone else that joined, and I hope everyone has a good rest of your day.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks all.